The restaurant went dead silent the moment my sister Cynthia slid the DNA test kit across the table and said the words that would eventually burn her entire world to ash. "Happy birthday, Piper. Why don't you finally figure out whose mistake you actually are?" She didn't whisper it. She announced it loud enough for the entire extended family to hear, and then she leaned back in her chair with that poisonous smile she'd perfected since childhood, waiting for me to crumble like I always did. But this time, as 32 candles flickered on the cake nobody would eat, and as my mother looked away pretending she hadn't heard, something inside me didn't break. It sharpened. Because what my sister didn't know was that I'm a data analyst. I don't just collect information. I find patterns where everyone else sees noise. And over the next 6 weeks, I would use every single skill I had to uncover a secret so devastating that it wouldn't just destroy Cynthia's smug superiority. It would detonate the foundation of lies our entire family had been built on. Before we get into exactly how I turned my sister's cruelty into her complete undoing, I want to ask you to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Stories like this, where the underestimated finally rise up and claim their power, don't get told enough. Your support helps me keep bringing you these moments of justice. Drop a like if you've ever been the one they underestimated, and stick with me until the very end, because what I discovered goes deeper than anyone could have imagined. My name is Piper Hartley, and for most of my 32 years, I have been the shadow daughter in a family that only had eyes for golden child Cynthia. Growing up in Milwaukee, I learned early that my accomplishments didn't matter. When I graduated top of my class, Cynthia got the celebration dinner because she'd worked so hard to pass her classes. When I got my first data analyst job at a Fortune 500 company, Mom threw Cynthia a party for getting hired as a receptionist at a dental office. The message was clear and consistent. Cynthia was the star. I was the support crew. But I told myself it was fine. I buried myself in spreadsheets and algorithms and convinced myself that quiet competence was its own reward. I believed that if I just kept my head down and stayed loyal, eventually my family would see my worth. I was wrong. The real crack started showing 2 years ago when my father was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Dad was a truck driver, a quiet man who spoke in nods and rough pats on the shoulder. And when the doctors gave him 6 months, I moved back home without hesitation. I took a remote position that paid less, rearranged my entire life, and became his primary caregiver. I learned to manage his medications, handle his insurance nightmares, hold his hand through chemo, and clean him up when the treatments made him too weak to stand. Cynthia visited exactly 3 times in those 2 years. The first time she showed up, she spent an hour complaining about her boyfriend's lack of ambition. The second time she stayed for 20 minutes before claiming she had a hair appointment. The third time was the funeral. Dad passed on a gray Tuesday morning in October. I was holding his hand when his breathing stopped, and for a moment the world felt impossibly still. But that stillness didn't last. By the time we returned from the cemetery, Cynthia was already asking about the life insurance payout. She cornered me in the kitchen while guests were still eating casserole and said, "So how much are we getting?" Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "Thank you for taking care of him." Just, "How much are we getting?" I told her I didn't know yet, that I was still processing the grief of losing the man who raised us, and she rolled her eyes like I was being deliberately difficult. "Whatever, Piper. Just make sure you let me know when the check clears. I have debts." That comment should have been my first warning, but I was too exhausted to fight. The next warning came a week later when I walked into Dad's study looking for his tax records and found the display case empty. Dad had collected vintage watches since before I was born. Nothing insanely expensive, but pieces he loved. A 1960s Timex he'd inherited from his own father. A Seiko diver he'd bought with his first big paycheck. They were supposed to stay in the family. They were gone. Every single one. I tore through the house looking for them, my heart pounding, until I found a crumpled receipt shoved into Cynthia's purse. She'd pawned them. All of them. For $3,000. Dad had been dead for 8 days. I confronted her that night in the living room with Mom present. I held up the receipt and asked her how she could steal from a dead man, how she could disrespect his memory like that, and Cynthia didn't even flinch. She shrugged and said, "He's not using them anymore." And I needed the money. When I turned to Mom for support, expecting her to be horrified, she sighed and said, "Piper, your sister is going through a hard time financially. Those watches were just sitting there collecting dust. Can't you be a little more understanding?" I felt something inside me crack, like a fault line forming deep underground. But I kept my voice steady and said, those watches were part of the estate. Selling them without going through probate is illegal. Cynthia laughed. Actually, I laughed. Oh, here we go. Piper the rule follower. Piper the perfect little saint. Get over yourself. Dad would have wanted me to have them. That's when Mom dropped the real bomb. She pulled out a folder of legal documents and slid them across the coffee table toward me. Piper, honey, we need to talk about the house. Cynthia needs it more than you do. You have a good job and no kids. She's struggling. So we're asking you to sign over half of the inheritance to her. I stared at the papers like they were written in a foreign language. You want me to give up my share of the house? The house Dad left to both of us. Mom nodded like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. It's the right thing to do. You'll still get a small payout from the life insurance. But Cynthia needs stability right now, and you're the one with the means to be generous. I looked at my sister. She wasn't even pretending to be grateful. She was scrolling through her phone, bored like this conversation was a minor inconvenience. I looked back at my mother and said, no. Just that. One word. Mom's face hardened. Piper, don't be selfish. I'm not being selfish. I'm being fair. I spent 2 years caring for Dad while Cynthia did nothing. I used my own savings to pay for his medical equipment when insurance wouldn't cover it. I put my career on hold. I gave up everything. And now you want me to hand over my inheritance because Cynthia made bad financial decisions. Cynthia finally looked up from her phone. You think you're so much better than me, don't you? Just because you have a boring desk job and no life. You're pathetic, Piper. You always have been. I stood up to leave and that's when my mother slapped me. Hard. Across the face. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. You are a cold, ungrateful child, she hissed. Your sister needs help and you're too selfish to see it. Get out of this house until you're ready to act like family. I touched my burning cheek, looked at Cynthia's smug expression and walked out the door. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just left. And as I sat in my car in the driveway, hands shaking on the steering wheel, I made a decision. I was done being a good daughter. I was done sacrificing for people who saw me as nothing more than a resource to exploit. If they wanted to treat me like I didn't matter, fine. But they were going to learn exactly what happens when you underestimate someone who knows how to dig through data and find the truth. The first thing I did when I got back to my apartment was open my laptop and start digging into Cynthia's finances. I'm a data analyst. I know how to trace digital footprints. I started with public records, property filings, court documents, anything available online. What I found made my blood run cold. Cynthia wasn't just struggling financially. She was drowning. She had maxed out 4 credit cards. She had 2 personal loans in default. She'd been evicted from her last apartment and was currently living with Mom rent-free. But here's the thing that didn't add up. Despite being broke, Cynthia was posting constant photos on social media of designer handbags, expensive dinners, and weekend trips to luxury resorts. Where was the money coming from? I cross-referenced her social media posts with her bank activity, and that's when I noticed something strange. Every time Cynthia posted about a big purchase, there was a corresponding deposit into her account from an LLC I didn't recognize. The name was generic. Hartley Holdings Group. It took me 3 days of digging, but I finally traced the LLC back to its registered owner. My mother. Mom was funneling money to Cynthia. Not small amounts. Thousands of dollars every month. And the money wasn't coming from Mom's savings. It was coming from Dad's life insurance payout. The payout that was supposed to be split between me and Cynthia. The payout that Mom claimed was still being processed. Mom had lied. She'd already received the money and instead of splitting it fairly, she'd set up a shell company to secretly funnel my half to Cynthia. I sat back in my chair staring at the screen and felt something settle into place. This wasn't just favoritism anymore. This was a fraud. And I had every transaction documented. But I didn't go to the police. Not yet. Because as I kept digging I found something else. Something that would change everything. I was looking through old family photos on Mom's computer, which I still had access to from when I was helping Dad with his medical records, and I found a folder labeled Legal, Do Not Open. Naturally, I opened it. Inside were scanned documents from 1992, the year I was born, medical records, paternity test results, and a letter from a lawyer. I read the letter 3 times before my brain could process what it was saying. My mother had an affair. In 1991. With a man named Garrett Cole. And when she got pregnant with me, she wasn't sure who the father was. So she took a paternity test in secret. The results confirmed it. My biological father wasn't the man who raised me. It was Garrett Cole. A man I'd never heard of. A man whose name never came up in family conversations. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped my phone. Everything made sense now. The way Mom treated me differently. The way she always defended Cynthia no matter what. Cynthia was Dad's real daughter. I was the evidence of her betrayal. I was the mistake. The secret. And Mom had spent my entire life resenting me for existing. I sat there in my apartment for hours staring at those documents and I felt something crack open inside my chest. Not sadness. Not even anger. Just a cold, clear understanding. My family had built their entire dynamic on a lie. And now I held the truth in my hands. I started planning the next day. My birthday was in 6 weeks, and Mom had already texted me saying we were doing a small family dinner at Cynthia's favorite restaurant. I knew exactly what that meant. Another public event where Cynthia would be celebrated and I would be tolerated. But this year I decided would be different. I spent those 6 weeks preparing meticulously. I compiled every piece of evidence I'd found. Financial fraud. The stolen watches. The shell company. The paternity test. I printed everything and organized it into color-coded folders. I also hired a private investigator to track down Garrett Cole. Turns out he was still alive, living 2 states over in Ohio, completely unaware he had a daughter. The investigator made contact and confirmed he'd be willing to meet me if I wanted. I told him I'd be in touch. Then I did something petty. I ordered my own DNA test kit. The same brand Cynthia had sent me as a gift for my birthday the year before. Back when she thought it would be hilarious to joke about me not looking like the rest of the family. I had it sent to my apartment and I waited. My birthday arrived on a cold Saturday in December. The restaurant was one of those trendy places with exposed brick and overpriced small plates. Mom, Cynthia, and Cynthia's enabling boyfriend Derek were already seated when I walked in. Nobody hugged me. Nobody said happy birthday. Cynthia looked me up and down and said, "You're late." I wasn't. I was exactly on time. But I didn't argue. I sat down, ordered a drink and waited. Dinner was the usual performance. Cynthia talked about herself for 45 minutes straight. Derek nodded along like a puppet. Mom hung on every word. I picked at my food and said nothing. Then, as the server brought out the cake, Cynthia reached into her purse and pulled out a small wrapped box. She slid it across the table with a grin that made my stomach turn. "Happy birthday, Piper," she said loudly, making sure nearby tables could hear. "I got you something special this year." I unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a DNA test kit. The same one I'd bought for myself weeks ago. The table went quiet. Cynthia leaned forward, her voice dripping with mock concern. "I just thought it might be good for you to finally figure out whose mistake you actually are. You know, since you've never really looked like the rest of us." The table erupted in awkward laughter. Derek chuckled. Mom looked away, uncomfortable but silent. And I felt every eye in that restaurant turn toward me, waiting to see if I would cry, if I would break, if I would run. Tad, I smiled. I reached into my bag and pulled out my own folder. The one I'd been preparing for 6 weeks. "Funny you should mention that, Cynthia," I said calmly. "Because I actually already did a DNA test. And you're right. I'm not Dad's biological daughter." The laughter stopped. Cynthia's grin faltered. Mom went pale. I opened the folder and pulled out the paternity test results from 1992. "But here's the interesting part," I continued, my voice steady. "Mom knew. She's known since before I was born. She had an affair with a man named Garrett Cole, and when she got pregnant with me she took a secret paternity test to confirm who the father was. She never told Dad. He never told me. She just let me grow up thinking I was part of this family while treating me like I was disposable." I slid the documents across the table. Mom's hands were shaking as she picked them up. Cynthia stared at me like I'd just detonated a bomb. Which, in a way, I had. "And while we're sharing family secrets," I said, pulling out the second folder, "let's talk about the money. Mom, you told me Dad's life insurance was still being processed. But that was a lie, wasn't it? You received the payout 3 months ago. $240,000. And instead of splitting it with me like Dad intended, You set up a shell company called Hartley Holdings Group and funneled my entire share to Cynthia. I pulled out the bank statements, the LLC registration, every transaction highlighted. That's fraud, Mom. Financial elder abuse actually, since you did it using Dad's estate. And Cynthia, you've been living off stolen money while pretending to be the victim. Cynthia's face went from smug to panicked in seconds. You're lying, she stammered. You're making this up because you're jealous. I pulled out my phone and turned it toward her. I recorded every transaction. I have emails. I have text messages where you and Mom discussed how to keep me from finding out. I have everything. The restaurant had gone completely silent. Other diners were staring. The server stood frozen near our table. Mom's voice came out strangled. Piper, you don't understand. I understand perfectly. I cut her off. You resented me my entire life because I was proof of your affair. So you decided I didn't deserve to be treated like family. You let Cynthia steal from me, lie to me, and humiliate me because in your mind I wasn't really yours. I stood up, gathering my folders. But here's the thing. I am a data analyst. I know how to find the truth. And now everyone here knows it too. I turned to walk out and Cynthia's voice cracked behind me. Where are you going? I looked back at her, at the panic in her eyes, and I felt nothing. I'm going to meet my real father. Garrett Cole. He lives in Ohio. I contacted him 2 weeks ago and unlike you people, he actually wants to meet me. When Mom? I've already filed a report with the probate court about the insurance fraud. They'll be contacting you soon. Happy holidays. I walked out of that restaurant into the cold Milwaukee night and for the first time in my life I felt light. Free. I didn't wait for them to call. I didn't wait for apologies I knew would never come. I drove home, packed a bag and booked a flight to Ohio. Garrett Cole met me at a small diner outside Columbus 2 days later. He was a tall man with kind eyes and when he saw me he smiled like he recognized something. You look like your mother, he said softly. But you have my stubborn jaw. We talked for 3 hours. He told me about the affair, how he'd loved my mother but she'd chosen to stay with her husband, how he'd never known she was pregnant. He cried when I showed him my baby photos. I would have been there, he said, his voice breaking. If I'd known, I would have been there for you. And I believed him. Back in Milwaukee, the fallout was immediate and brutal. The probate court launched an investigation into the life insurance payout. Mom was forced to return my half-plus penalties. Cynthia's boyfriend left her the moment he realized she was broke and facing potential legal consequences. The family home, the one they'd tried to steal from me, was sold to cover legal fees. Mom and Cynthia moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city, and from what I heard through mutual acquaintances, they blamed me for everything. They told anyone who would listen that I was vindictive, that I'd destroyed the family over money, that I was cruel. They never once acknowledged what they'd done. But I didn't care. Because I wasn't their family anymore. I'm sitting in a coffee shop in Columbus as I record this, preparing to spend my first real Christmas with my biological father and his family. They're warm. They're kind. They actually want me here. And as I look back on everything that happened, I realize that my sister was right about one thing. I am another man's daughter. But I'm not mistaken. I'm the result of a lie that my mother created and a truth she tried to bury. And the moment I stopped letting her define my worth was the moment I finally became free. If you made it to the end of this story, thank you for being here. If you've ever been the scapegoat in your family, the one they blamed for their own failures, I want you to know something. You are not the problem. You never were. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is walk away from people who will never see your value. Hit that subscribe button if stories like this resonate with you, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every single one. And remember, the truth doesn't destroy families. Lies do. The truth just reveals what was already broken.